Those long, uneven lines, standing as patiently as if they were stretched outside the Oval or Villa Park, the crowns of hats, the sun on moustached, archaic faces, grinning as if it were all an August bank holiday lark. Never such innocence, never before or since, has changed itself to past without a word, the men leaving the gardens tidy, the thousands of marriages lasting a little while longer, never such innocence again. So John Surtees, that is Philip Larkin's great poem, 1914, on the outbreak of the First World War. And I'm embarrassed to say, even as this is going out over on The Rest is History, the other podcast I do, we're doing a series on the build up to the First World War, and we opened the series with that very same poem. But the reason for doing it is obviously, firstly, that it's a brilliant poem, and it evokes that sense of the great rupture in British life that the First World War constituted. But it's also because, of course, it names the cricket ground that we're doing this series about, the Oval, and
Yeah,
pairs it
yeah,
with Britain's most historic football ground and home to England's best football team, Villa Park. So for me, it's an absolute double whammy. But I can't help wondering whether actually, in a way, cricket, even more than football, is a kind of signifier of everything that people in the trenches dreamed of and felt they'd lost. And the reason I think that is there's another famous poem by Siegfried Sassoon, who so Larkin was writing about the war long after it had finished, but Sassoon, of course, was he fought in it,
yeah.
and he wrote this terrible poem in which he opens by saying, "Soldiers are citizens of death's grey land," and then he says, "I see them in foul dugouts gnawed by rats, and in the ruined trenches lashed with rain, dreaming of things they did with balls and bats." So that sense of, I suppose, the golden summer of August 1914, which we've already talked about, haven't we, in the context of our episode on Jack Hobbs. Um,
Mm, yeah.
and you're in a trench being pelted with rain. I mean, it is the kind of thing you would imagine. The sacred turf of the
Yeah,
Oval, particularly,
yeah,
perhaps.
yeah, and the image of that halcyon image of cricket on the village green with a pint of warm bitter and yeah, we talked a lot about in the Hobbs episode, I think about the nature of pre-war celebrity as well, and the sort of the veneration that society had for cricketers in those times, much more so than footballers, and I think it was people. It evokes that spirit of dreaming of an afternoon at the Oval, dreaming of an afternoon of Jack Hobbs, and then maybe going back and playing a bit of cricket yourself, and yeah, it shows the as much as anything, I suppose, the place cricket had in society as we entered that period, and it's a tragic, awful metaphor that Larkin's making, but I think from the perspective of the Oval to be mentioned so in such a way by one of the finest poets of the 20th century is something that not many sports grounds can claim, and something I think
Well,
is
only
is is
Villa
a
Park.
wonderful only Villa Park as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. But that's a wonderful thing for the Oval to have.
so this is all by way of preamble to the subject of today, which is the Oval at war. So, the First and the Second World Wars, these great ruptures in the course of 20th century cricket at the Oval, and perhaps we should just look at how the Oval comes to be caught up in the war, because that summer of 1914, as we've already mentioned in the Hobbs episode, Surrey are going great guns. They haven't won the championship all through the 20th century, but it looks as if they're going to in 1914. They're way ahead. They're
It's on the
kind of
cards.
they're absolutely on the cards, and so on the 3rd of August, which is a bank holiday, 15,000 people come to, they queue in the go through the turnstiles, sit down to watch the first day of Surrey's match against Nottinghamshire. And Hobbs, in peerless form, gets his highest score of the season. So that's another 100 for him. And Surrey in total make a formidable 542. And it's the measure of how well they've been going that this is the third time that summer that they've
Yeah.
made a score over 500. But the 3rd of August is also the day that Germany invades Belgium. And this is essentially what makes it inevitable that Britain will join the war in alliance with France and against Germany. And this duly happens the next day on the 4th of August. Meanwhile, at the Oval, Nottinghamshire, I'm afraid, are not playing a cavalier innings. They're going very, very slowly. And the barracking becomes so bad that at times, according to newspaper reports, several of the offenders were removed by the police. And then the next day it rains. So it's a kind of
Uh,
it's a
well,
really it's a kind of damp squib for the for Surrey's last match that's played at the Oval, because Britain, of course, by the 4th of August is at war. And although it's only for 2 weeks, the army requisitions the Oval. And this is a kind of signal, isn't it, that, cricket is
yeah.
over.
Yeah, absolutely, and yeah, I think there's a sort of small amount of very very basic army training done at the Oval during that period, and as the rush of war comes, there's the decision is made. I think, as we've discussed previously, Tom, that it's needed to appoint
Yeah.
a champion county, almost for the sort of sake of national morale. I think, to abandon the county championship was considered not the right thing to do. So various officials retreat to a smoky room in Lords and emerge with the proclamation that Surrey have won their first county championship of the 20th century,
Yeah. So the
which
First
is
World
listed
War,
alongside all the rest.
not all bad. Uh, so in that sense,
No,
um, and that is, yeah. So that
yeah,
meeting of a committee at Lords is on the 9th of November, 1914.
yeah,
That says that Surrey should be declared champions, and then a month later, in the pages of the Times, there's a list of all the first class county cricketers who have enlisted, of whom, of course, Hobbs is not one. But there are 18 um, Surrey players, including Percy Fender, who we selected as our top Surrey captain, and Lord
yeah,
Dalmeny, who obtained the ostrich feather um, logo for Surrey. So
yeah,
that's very significant. And over the
yeah,
course of the
yeah.
war,
Big names.
big names, and over the course of the war, um, 8 people who had played first class cricket for Surrey never come back to the Oval. And I guess probably the best of them, the most significant cricketer, the most able, and indeed the most notorious, is an Aussie called Alan Marshall.
Yeah, Alan
And
Marshall. Yeah,
so obviously, I mean, he wasn't born in Kennington. So like Hobbs, he has to do
no,
a 2-year qualification program. But it's quite controversial, isn't
it-
it?
yeah.
Because it gets out that
Yeah, he's come a little further than Hobbes. I think it's
yeah, he
important to
has.
note. He's this fella was born in Queensland. Yeah, played for South Brisbane, played for Paddington in Sydney, played for Queensland. Yeah, arrived off the boat in 1905. So, yeah, in terms of the controversy, yeah, coming from Queensland is I think I think coming from Cambridge is controversial. Coming from Queensland possibly takes it to a new level.
Yeah, but also what's controversial, it's not just that he's Australian, but also that rather like they've done with Hobbs, the Surrey committee subsidise him. They give him an allowance over the winter
Yeah,
months to make sure that he can hold out. And he's a great all rounder. So he's actually
yeah,
in 1909 he's Wisden's Cricketer of the Year, and they praise him as a
yeah,
hitter of greater natural powers has seldom been seen. So the first in a long line of big hitting Australians who will come and play for Surrey. Um,
yeah, yeah.
but
Absolutely, the natural forerunner to Aaron Finch.
that same year, unfortunately, he gets involved in a police related incident, and it's the most ludicrous. I mean, it's so ludicrous. They've all this, and we
Yeah,
get this from Hobbes's journal. Marshall and a load of the other Surrey lads have got a children's football, and they're kicking it around in the street, and a policeman comes up and says,
in
"Oi, oi,
Chesterfield.
what is going on here?" And demands to know Marshall's name. And Marshall said, "I'm not going to give you my name, mate." And so he gets hauled off to the police station, and it creates unpleasantness. I think the head of the police force where he's been arrested says this is nonsense. These are sportsmen. We can rely on them not to. If sportsmen can't kick a football around in the street, what is Britain coming to? But the
Yeah.
Surrey committee, they're not having this, and they dismiss him. So poor old Marshall goes back to Australia, and he plays there. And then when the war breaks out, he signs up as a private. He goes to Gallipoli, and like so many people in the war, he doesn't get killed by enemy action. He dies of a fever. He's been taken on a
Mm,
hospital ship to Malta, and that's where he dies. And John, is one
mm.
of only um, two privates who appear on the Surrey County Cricket War Memorial that anyone who's been in the long
Yeah.
room of the Oval will have seen. It's a list of
Mm.
48 names, isn't it? So 46 of those 48 names had a commission. They have a rank, and it's that the identity of these 48 people on the war memorial in the pavilion is the subject of a fantastic book, isn't it? Researched by Philip
It is,
Payne
yeah.
and introduced by none other than Daniel
Philip Payne,
Norcross,
yeah.
who was on last week.
Daniel Norcross. Yeah, when we talk about ranks as well, I think it's. I just wanted to bring up another fella as well. It's a fascinating guy. He's called Hubert Pennington Catley.
Yeah, this is a
Also on the memorial,
really interesting story.
one of the 48. Yeah. So Catley, he's described by Dan in his introduction to the book as frustratingly enigmatic. He's educated at Eton, goes to Merton College, Oxford, where he failed to complete his degree. But nonetheless, Eton and Merton is a pretty illustrious schooling. And then his family contains Liberal MPs, radical suffragettes. They have houses in central London, very large fortunes. And yet, at his death, in the war, he left £154, 18 shillings and ninepence, and dropped out of university, became a bank clerk, and died as a private age 26. It's an extraordinary thing. Him and
Yeah,
him
so
and
what's going
Marshall,
on
who's
there?
an Australian.
I mean,
Yeah, it's a
Marsh,
fascinatingly enigmatic life.
but I mean, we know why Marshall's there because he played first class cricket for Surrey. But why is
Mm,
I mean, lots of these people haven't even played second 11 cricket, but it's
yeah,
explained in the committee minutes for the 20th of November in 1919, where it says it was decided that a war memorial to those who fell in the war should be provided to include amateur and professional players of the first and second 11. So that's clear enough. Whether members of the club or not, members of the staff and members of the club. So you
mm,
just had to be a member and you get on the war memorial. And I agree, there are
yeah,
some absolutely fascinating stories among these. So there's no question the guy who has the best name on the
yeah.
list, and this is this is Victor
It jumps out,
Shrapnel.
doesn't it?
I mean,
Yeah,
honestly, Victor Shrapnel,
yeah, yeah.
and
It's
and he
extraordinary. Yeah,
he. I mean, so you have the whole thing about the First World War. You have the sense of a generation of young men cut off in their prime, and just reading about Shrapnel's achievements. So he went to Wilson's Grammar School in Sutton, still going strong.
yeah.
And for them, for the first 11, he took 197 wickets at an average of 6.75. I mean, you'd take that, wouldn't you? That's not bad. But
Well, I mean,
John,
any day, any
that's
day.
that's not everything. He also broke the long
Yeah,
jump record and the mile record. He captained the school chess team and the debating society, and he got a scholarship to Magdalen College, Oxford, when he was just 17. And then he goes out and gets
yeah.
killed. Terrible.
Okay. Well, let me bring up another chap on the memorial who I think is extraordinary. This guy called John Raphael. So John Raphael is more well known in rugby circles than cricket circles. Played 9 games for England at rugby, but still had the time to score 3,700 first class runs at 30. He was an amazing swimmer and apparently a champion fencer as well. And also in 1909 stood for Parliament in Croydon as a Liberal. Um, so he very sadly passed away at the Battle of Messines Ridge on June 11th, 1917. He was described in his Wisden obituary. Wisden wrote, "Everything he did created more than ordinary interest. His popularity as a man, apart from his ability, counting for much." Which is an amazing, I think, amazing way to describe somebody. And there's an extraordinary coda to Raphael's life, which is included in this book, The 48. It was reported by the Daily Express in 2014 that Against military rules, his mother's ashes were buried alongside his at the Lissenhoek military cemetery in 1930. At the time, the rules strictly forbade such an arrangement, but his mother Harriet visited his grave in 1929, met the groundsman at the cemetery, Walter Sutherland, explained that she was in very poor health and her dying wish was to be buried with her son. 13 months later, Sutherland received a package containing Harriet's ashes. The Express goes on to say that without telling a soul, he sought the fallen soldier's tombstone and beside it dug a small hole. Within a few minutes, the ashes were buried and the turf replaced. The secret remained in Sutherland's family for more than 80 years. His son George, then aged 92, said what he did was in defiance of the rules, so he knew he could not mark her name on the grave, but he said a short prayer and always said he had done right.
He did do right, I think, didn't he? I mean, it's like a
Yeah,
Kipling short story.
extraordinary.
It's incredibly powerful and moving. Um,
Yeah.
so just to finish I mean the book is wonderful, and in a way the kind of
Mm,
the random character of all these various people is part of the fascination of it. But just to end with
mm,
the way that two of them died. So one of them, George Cooper, who was he was a member of the club. He wasn't a player, and he was a member of the Territorials and was in India when the war broke out, at Jhansi, which was the home of the Rani of Jhansi, who was one of the kind of the heroines of the Indian War of Independence. Um, but he was there, and in 1915 he was shot by by two of his own men, who were described in the newspaper as Mohammedan soldiers, so Muslim soldiers, who saluted him and then shot him in the back. And the newspaper report that we have for this, they don't explain why he did this, but they add significantly that these two soldiers were reported to have been of a morose and fanatical disposition. So
yeah.
so he's the only person
Incredible.
to have been shot by his own men. Um, there is
Yeah.
also, on
Wow.
a kind of slightly more upstanding note, we also have Harold May, who again didn't play for either the first or seconds, but had played for the young amateurs against the young professionals at the Oval in 1905. So he was an officer at Ypres, and in 1915 he was wounded there while, in the words of his company commander, very gallantly bringing his platoon up into the front trench, and he was stretched off the battlefield, taken to a hospital in Boulogne, and while he was there in bed, hopefully recuperating as as he hoped, um, and while he was in bed there, trying to get over his wounds, which were very severe, he wrote to his old headmaster, which seems to have been very much the kind of thing that people in the First World War did. And this is
Mm.
how he described what had happened. Suddenly, the most awful hail of shrapnel came over the crest at the dugouts. A whole battery fired high velocity shrapnel for over an hour. Down came the trees, up came tons of earth. The men scurried up into the trench pretty quick, and one shell burst alongside me and sent me toppling down the hill into a pond at the bottom. It felt just like being popped on the thigh at the footer, though, of course, the shell made a beastly mess of the leg, and he died 2 weeks later. But there you have,
It's
the comparison
extraordinary.
of a brutal wound to a sports injury, and the
Yeah.
understatement. I mean, it's everything that you associate with the officer class in the First World War.
It really is. Can I just bring one more to the table
Yeah,
here as
yeah.
well?
Let's
This is
have one
also
more.
from the 48. Before we finish on this, there's Captain Esme Chinnery. Um,
Crazy
so
name,
he
crazy
and his
guy.
half brother, he and his brother both died sadly in the First World War. Esme Chinnery's father was quite well known in the sort of middle of the 19th century. He held the world mile record for a period. He ran the mile in 4 minutes 29 seconds in the mid 19th century. Esme had played one first class game for Surrey where he got 47. Then was initially in the household brigade and signed up to become a flying officer in 1913. He died in January 1915. He was a passenger in a plane flying over Paris near the Eiffel Tower which was reported to be flying perilously close to the roofs of the buildings in central Paris, and then eventually was, I think, clipped a building and ended up crashing in central Paris, where it sort of burst into a fireball, and both the occupants passed away. It was an extraordinary thing, just to think of all the different things that was going on around the world, and to sort of die in a plane crash
Yeah,
near the Eiffel Tower. And yeah, the Sussex Daily News remembered him as a most charming man and one of the most brilliant members of the Royal Flying Corps. Just this extraordinary. And when you're stood there in the long room and you see those 48 names, the wonderful thing about this book is it really does present them
yeah,
all as
it,
individuals
it really does.
and members of a whole, members of a collective. It's
Yeah,
an amazing an amazing thing, and I think all credit and power to be given to the Surrey community, the Surrey committee, for making the decision they made back in 1919 to produce a memorial of such democracy, if you like.
yeah, absolutely. Well, although of course, as we've said, only two privates on the board, so that's, I mean, what sociological lessons one would draw from that, but very interesting. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that in the wake of the First
Yes,
World War,
yes,
and again we touched on this in connection with Hobbes, and um, I actually just listened to that episode before we were recording this, and in that we said how Hobbes's batting in the 20s had the impact it did because of the troubled circumstances that Britain was in then, with the general strike and with the economy in a terrible way. But of course, what we didn't say was that it was also in the shadow of the First World War, and so Hobbes's batting was everything that people had been yearning for in the trenches,
yeah,
um, uh, well, as they fought in the war to end all wars. Except, of course, it wasn't the war to end all wars, and the decades pass, and at the end of the summer in 1913, the Surrey team are traveling to, they're traveling up to Manchester to play Lancashire at Old Trafford, and they're changing trains at Crewe, and they're delayed there for 3 hours because the railway system is completely choked with the movement, again, of troops, but also a novelty now of evacuees being taken from London at the threat of another war, and war is yet to break out. But of course, you know, the storm clouds of war are gathering again. And
yeah,
we are hugely fortunate to have with us on this podcast now the person who's perhaps best qualified in the world to talk about the role that the Oval played in the Second World War. And it's a person that I absolutely have on tap because it's my brother, James Holland. Very, very distinguished
welcome.
historian of the Second World War, written absolutely definitive accounts of a whole range of campaigns and of the war itself. But perhaps just as significantly is a Surrey member and has sat next to me through many a match. So thank you so much for joining us, brother of
Welcome,
mine.
James.
Well, it's an absolute thrill to be on. As you both know, the Oval is my favourite cricket ground in the world, and there's nowhere better to watch cricket as far as I'm concerned. So, very, very thrilled to be part of this. And it's always a joy to be able to, even though it's a slightly depressing subject, to be able to kind of link cricket to my professional work. And I think that last summer is really interesting. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, that the First World War breaks out right in the middle of the season. The Second World War breaks out just in time for the 1939 season to pretty much finish, but not quite. And there's this amazing line from Leary Constantine on the eve of the third and final Test match that summer against West Indies.
Which is
Leary
at the
Constantine, of
Oval.
course, being the captain of, which is at the Oval, of course, yeah.
Yeah,
And he, of course, is the captain of the West Indies. And he says, there's such terrible news from Poland. War is now inevitable. We go out to play the final Test tomorrow. Wally Hammond puts it a little bit more succinctly. He just goes, "Oh Christ! Now the cat's amongst the effing pigeons." The storm clouds of war, as you put it, bro, are very
Yeah,
much
well,
kind of
it's my own
overshadowing
metaphor.
that final Test match. But I know, it's a brilliantly original one. And
Thanks.
but in that final Test match, I mean, great things happen. I mean, it's a good swan song in a way. Hammond and Hutton both get hundreds. Leary Constantine gets 79 and 5 for 75. Amazingly, one of the England bowlers, Walter Keaton, takes a wicket with his first ball in Test cricket. It's his only Test match. And it's his
Oh.
only Test match because of the war comes. I mean, how cruel is that? And that's. And I remember talking very clearly. I remember talking to Reg Simpson, the Nottinghamshire in England Test batsman, who ended up flying transport planes in Southeast Asia. And he just pointed out that the absolute prime of his cricketing life was taken away by having to go off and fight
But
the war.
Kenneth Weeks
And
was
this was the point.
Kenneth Weeks was the last Test cricketer to be born in the United States. Is that right?
Yep,
Yeah.
it's also his
So
last Test match.
far,
Bam Bam
although that
Weeks.
may change.
It may
That
change.
may well change.
Who knows?
May well
But
change.
yes, I mean there were 6 players who played their last Test match in that Test match. England players out of the 11 that played their last Test match at the Oval between the 19th and 22nd of August 1939. Stan Nichols, Walter Keaton, who we just mentioned a moment ago, Norman Oldfield, Arthur Wood, Tom Goddard, and Reg Parks. I mean, it just underlines, doesn't it? That this was a long war. It's 5.5 years, best part of 6 years, and that's a big chunk when you're a young man and you're in your playing prime.
And
James, just a question: that 1939 Test. Can you take us into the London that surrounded that Test match, as the crowds flocked to the ground and sat there watching Constantine and Keaton and everyone in that game? What was the London that surrounded them looking like?
Well, yes. So it's already ready for war. I mean, everyone's on a war footing. They have been in a way since 1938 and the Munich crisis, which obviously war is averted then. But at that point, the trenches start being dug in Hyde Park, but also Kennington Park just behind. And so there's trenches, there's sandbags around buildings, there's barrage balloons. Barrage balloons look like a sort of cartoon bomb. So they're sort of silvery and sort of lozenge shape with fins, and they're suspended on wires.
They're to stop.
And the idea is to stop
enemy bombers,
low-lying.
right?
Exactly, to stop enemy bombers or fighter planes or whatever coming in at low level, and so they're already hovering over much of London, much of central London, and there are several in the park just behind the Oval. And so, if you walked out on that last Test match, you would have seen them hovering above,
And
just behind the
and
pavilion. I mean, incredible sight, really.
And there's a gun in the Holliford Road.
There's an anti-aircraft gun, mounted on a kind of, on a platform in the Harleyford Road. So as people were walking into the Test match, they would have walked, from that direction. Wow. They would have seen it. I mean, it's extraordinary.
It's absolutely extraordinary.
The last round of county matches happens, but a lot of them are suspended or turned into 2 days from 3. So there's only one game being played on Saturday, the 1st of September, which is, of course, the day that German troops march into Poland. And that is the Sussex match against Yorkshire.
And the Oval itself has been requisitioned actually before Britain declares war on Germany.
As it was in 1914.
Yeah, but in 1914 it's returned after 2 weeks. But in the Second World War,
no such. It doesn't get returned until the very end of the war in 1945.
And so, what's it used for?
And the reason it's been requisitioned, is to turn it into what is expected to be a prison of war cage for German paratroopers, which are expected to, may or may not come down. Everyone's obsessed with paratroopers at this point. And so it's a holding camp. It's not a kind of proper camp, but it's, if people are attacking London and they, airmen or whatever, they attack and they come down and they're captured, this is where they'll be corralled to start off with before being put into other camps. So they do start, it just seems absolutely unbelievable now that they're putting kind of concrete posts into the outfield and putting out wire and stuff. There's quite a famous photograph, which you'll have seen, John, definitely, of it being transformed into this prison of war cage, and it's it's sacrilegious. I mean, it's unbelievable seeing it all, and the kind of damage that must be going on to the outfield is just one shudders to think about it.
It's amazing. So the contrast to what happened in 1946 when the Oval extraordinarily hosted a full season of cricket under the wonderful captaincy of Major Nigel Harvey Bennett, who we all learnt about in the previous episode. Just one of the all-time great Surrey characters. But when you look at that photograph on that corridor in the pavilion, and you see what the Oval looked like when it was requisitioned during the war, the concept of playing a full season in 1946 is very, very far from your mind. I
Yeah,
think.
amazing. And
Yeah, I mean,
but in the event,
it's
bro, just hold on. But in the event, paratroopers don't land on London, and so actually the Oval is not needed to keep prisoners of war. But there is a German pilot who gets captured, isn't there? Just outside
Yeah.
the Oval. So can you tell us a story about that?
yes, and actually it's connected to possibly one of the most famous photographs ever taken during the Battle of Britain, which is of this tailless Dornier bomber descending kind of vertically in the sharp direction of Victoria Station. And this happens on the 15th of September 1940, which, as well as being your wife's birthday, bro, is also Battle of Britain Day. And this is one of the kind of sort of culmination big air battles as a kind of sort of a peak at first of all around midday to the southeast of London. Then a second larger formation, a larger bomber formation comes over towards London at about, which peaks at around 3 p.m. And at this point, there's Oberleutnant Robert Zeber, who was this Dornier 17 bomber pilot. This is a kind of twin-engine bog standard German bomber of 1940. Is flying over and he gets attacked by Hurricanes of the Czech squadron, 310 squadron. And very badly hit. And the gunner, who is Unterofficer Gustav Hubel, and the observer, Unterofficer Hans Goschenhofer, are both killed, and the plane is in pretty bad order. So Oberleutnant Robert Zeber, the pilot, orders everyone to bail out. And he jumps out. And what then happens is that the plane then flies on. And what happens is one of the other Hurricane pilots sees it, a British Hurricane pilot, Ray Holmes, sees it flying towards kind of, a slow dive and thinks he needs to go and attack it, gets it all lined up, presses the gun button, realizes he's run out of ammunition, and makes a split-second decision to slice off the tail with his wing. So he actually flies into it, chops off the tail of the Dornier, which is why this moment is able to be captured by a photographer on the ground, seeing it diving vertically towards Victoria Station, where it duly crashes. But the pilot then floats down and gets caught up on a telegraph pole. His parachute gets caught on a telegraph pole, so that he's left hanging there on the top of this pole in his parachute, about a few feet from the ground, and the Blitz is only kind of 8 days in. It starts on Saturday the 7th of September, Black Saturday as it becomes known. And all the locals are incredibly angry, upset, distraught about all the bombing that's been going on, and they attack him. He gets lynched, including women with pokers and knives, and gets very badly wounded until he's kind of rescued by the Home Guard, who kind of pack him off to hospital. But he dies the following day. And that's right next to
but they take him. I read that they took him across the turf of the Oval.
Yes, they did.
So
Yeah.
So
he was dripping
more,
blood onto dripping blood onto the hallowed
sacred turf.
Yeah.
Yeah,
madness.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. But why would they have done that? Any reason? Because the roads were still, usable, accessible.
Maybe they were escaping.
I think he was just on one
know.
side, and they were trying to get him to an ambulance on the other side. I think, and it was just the quickest route.
Just the quickest route straight.
Yeah,
across,
that's my reading of it. I mean, no one's gone into that detail, but I can't think of any other reason why.
And so, and so this is the kind of the onset of the Blitz, and it goes all through the remaining months of 1940, and exactly a month after that incident, on the 15th of October 1940, the worst bombing incident of the war in Kennington happens, and it doesn't actually hit the Oval, does it? But it hits a kind of a shallow air raid shelter, kind of a trench in Kennington Park, where people have had to take shelter because the Oval Tube Station itself is surrounded by barbed wire fence, because of the Oval nearby, that it's sensitive military territory. And that's how many people die in that? I can't remember.
Well, it's partly that, and so it's mainly because they're trying to stop them using the
46
it's
bodies.
48.
48.
48. The main reason why they've got the Oval Station with wire at it is because they're trying to stop people from using it as a shelter. You know, the underground stations become shelters, but initially that is discouraged by the government. You have to
Oh, I
remember
see.
that
Right.
the 15th of October is only 5 weeks
Yeah.
into the Blitz, and still the government is still responding to, you know, what's the best way to deal with this, with these night raids. And there are all these trenches, and they had been dug in 1938 during the Munich crisis, and they're huge. They're two really long trenches with then a series of shorter cross sections across them. So it's like, looks like a sort of giant noughts and crosses, you know, on etched into the park, and they're quite deep, these trenches, and you go down into them, and they're earth and everything, but they've been revetted with, you know, boards on either side, and then they're covered with stiff corrugated steel, a bit like the Anderson shelters, and covered with earth on top.
Yeah.
So they're incredibly bomb resistant unless a bomb absolutely lands on them. Now the chance
And
of a
that's what
bomb
happens, and it's a
landing in a
direct
kind of
hit, is it?
comparatively narrow space, it's a direct hit, and it's just terrible luck.
Yeah.
It's just appalling. And of course the wave of this shock just goes either side of the trench. You know, the blast goes down the length of the trench, and that's why so
Yeah.
many, and of course
Yeah.
causes a huge amount of damage.
Terrible.
And people are blown to pieces, but they're also suffocated by the collapse of the trench and the soil and all the rest of it.
And so what about
So it's
the oval
absolutely
itself?
horrific.
What about the oval itself?
Yeah,
Is the
it
oval
gets hit.
itself hit?
It gets hit repeatedly. Yeah, it hits so many times. I mean, in November 1940, the front tavern is really badly hit. Also, the East Mound. Another bomb lands on the terrace in front of the long room. This brings
Wow.
down part of the balcony and part of the roof. Doors are damaged, windows, all the glass smashed in. I mean, it looks an absolute state.
Honestly,
Part of the
those
wall
Nazi
around
fiends.
the oval is also those Nazi fiends. Part of the wall surrounding the ground is also badly damaged when a bomb falls in the aforementioned Harleyford Road. May 1941, the Blitz is coming to an end. It comes to an end in the middle of May 1941, but not before the Oval gets bombed again. Once more, the Tavern and Pavilion are damaged, and you know the committee for Surrey are having they've got a pickle on their hands because you know they've had to suspend contracts of players and stuff. You know the whole thing's wind down. It's a bit like COVID. You know when you've got a business, it's fully functioning. No one's kind of, you know, suddenly everything, you know, all your income goes. You know, how do you deal with this? And the damage is extreme. You know, partly to the ground. Actually, the square has been kind of pretty much left alone, but the outfield is in a state. The infrastructure of the ground, the pavilion, the taverns, the wall, other stands, they're in a really, really bad way as well. And you know, it's hoped that the War Damage Committee, which has been set up to kind of cover all this rebuilding project, is gonna help at the end of the war, but it doesn't really. I mean, you know, the amount of money that's handed over is pretty minimal, frankly.
But amazingly, amid all this damage, cricket is played at the
Yep.
Oval, isn't it? Because in 1941, the Surrey Colts play, and they feature a very
Not at the
promising
Oval.
young boat.
Not at the Oval.
Oh, it's not at the Oval. Oh, I see.
No, they don't
Okay.
play the Oval at all. There's no match at the Oval, but Surrey does. But you know, so there are games. So cricket is played throughout the war. There's lots of sort of regimental teams.
So where are
There's
Surrey
some
playing?
incredibly good teams. I mean, so Surrey are playing at kind of outgrounds, you know,
Guildford
around
and-
Surrey. They also arrange a tour, you know, where in the summer they're planning a tour in 1940, all of which comes to nothing because of the Blitzkrieg in the West, which is launched on the 10th of May 1940. But the plan originally was to send out this tour of as many Surrey players as possible and take them round Surrey doing kind of, you know, exhibition matches and what have you. And keep it going. You know, it was considered, you know, hugely important for morale that cricket was still played. I mean, there were 26 matches at Lord's, for example, in 1940. And that's because it was only being used as an RAF recruitment centre rather
Yeah,
than
of course it
you know,
was.
so the
Yeah, of
ground
course.
was
Absolutely
unfettered.
classic.
You know, so yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I know, classic. Always get out there. I mean,
but
it's not who you
these
know,
Colts,
it's not what you know, it's who you know, etc. Yeah.
but these Colts, the
So the Colts are important.
who are playing in 1941, and they feature a
Yep.
very promising youngster called Alec Bedser, who on one occasion
Yes.
takes 8 wickets for 10. So if only Britain
and gets 53 not out.
Yeah. So if only Britain can win the war
Amazing.
and get the Oval back, then things are looking quite promising for Surrey, aren't they? But of course, they do
Yep.
have the problem that they've got massive, great steel cages all over the place, and they've got bomb damage on
Yep.
the pavilion and everything. So, as you said, they need to raise money. So when the war comes to an end, um, the Surrey Committee are in a real pickle, and they've been relying, haven't they, on the kind of donations of Surrey members and people who continue to pay their subs even though they can't go to the ground or anything like that. Um, and it's the 100th and it's the centenary of the club on the 21st of August 1945, and they launch an appeal. And John, we've been talking about how the Oval, as well as being the people's ground, is also royalty's ground. And I was thrilled to read that the
Yeah.
King, George VI, he's the patron of the club. He made a donation of £100, which I think reflects very, very well
Oh
on him.
wow.
Very well on him.
Well done him.
Yeah, well done
And
him.
Yeah,
he's my
that's
favourite monarch.
wonderful.
Always has been. Always been my favourite monarch. George VI, absolute
There's
legend.
there's an incredible British Pathé video that was made in support of the 1946 appeal, which features some wonderful footage of Surrey in pre-season training, including the Bedser twins and Laurie Fishlock and some of the great players who would go on to be in that team in the 1950s with major, I think, ERT Holmes, who I think is possibly responsible for the Nigel Bennett catastrophe,
Yeah.
but on this occasion
Yeah.
is appealing for people, and he's sort of in a very sort of Harry Enfield-esque 1946 English accent, in his sort of rounded hat and pinstripe suit. I'm essentially says, I'm not too proud to beg, but, and then asks people to send checks, essentially free post to the Oval, to raise funds. But you do see in this footage, like, Pathé have clearly got their camera around the Oval, and you do see the state of some of the stands and the damage that is yet to be repaired. It's an amazing. You talk about Lords getting away with being an RAF recruitment centre and playing 26 games. I guess someone at Surrey must have known someone from British Pathé to get them to come over and
Yeah.
make the
Yeah.
video, because I can't imagine they had time to make many things like that.
But
Well,
John,
the cost is reckoned to be £50,000, which is it's about 1.5 million in today's money. So it's a
Yeah.
huge sum that they have
Yeah.
to find. The other problem they've got is that the groundsman who's been the previous pre-war groundsman, Bossa Martin, is retired in
Bossa
1941.
Martin.
Yeah, he's retired in 1941, and he's the guy who's responsible for that kind of amazing batting track for Hobbs, etc.
Yeah.
But he retires, and so they don't replace him because there's no ground to be up. There's no cricket to be played, and there's nothing to be upkept. So not only have they got all this damage, they've also got to find a new groundsman. The new groundsman arrives in post in the summer of 1945, a chap called Bert Locke. He's got just a phenomenal task on his hands between the winter of 1945 and spring of 1946 to get the game ready. And amazingly, it happens. They get the money, they get the ground sorted out. I mean, certainly the outfield and all the rest of it. I don't think all the bomb damage is entirely repaired by 1946, but they play a full season in 1946. It's absolutely astonishing.
So I mean,
Tom.
What?
I was just going to say, Tom, we spent a bit of time talking about our favourite hirsute Surrey Victorians and some of the top lip cover and the sideburns and the Victorians. But Locke also features in the Pathé video of 1946, and is just in the decade before Dennis Compton has got some wonderful Brill cream. Just again another really fantastic Surrey haircut on Bert Locke.
So these are all very signs of hope, aren't they? The war is over, and even though London is blitzed, pockmarked with damage, the Oval itself bearing the scars of war, the Brill cream pots are out. The turf is being prepared. The money is coming in from the King and various other people, and you have this young colt, Alec Bedser, who presages all kinds of good things for Surrey. And so in the next two episodes, we'll be going post-war. We'll be looking at one of the most famous innings ever played at the Oval in our next episode. And then after that, we'll be looking to see what contribution Alec Bedser and other young shavers end up making in the 1950s to Surrey's record. But before we finish, there is one other way in which the Oval was scheduled to play a role in a war. And I was tipped off about this by Julie McDowell, who wrote a brilliant book called Attack Warning Red, which is about British preparations for nuclear war. So basically, the Third World War. And she sent me a news clipping from The Independent, which was dated to the 28th of October, 1988. And I'll just read it. It's a chilling coda to everything that we have been talking about today. The macabre absurdities of nuclear forward planning will not cause much amusement in the members' bar of the Oval Cricket Ground, the article in The Independent reads. Those hallowed acres have been penciled in as a burial ground. The Oval is perfect for the task. It is not close to any water source, although of course that's not true because we've got the River Effra actually that could be polluted. Is pretty central. I mean, it's central, and is flat. And John, this is shocking. Easily dug up by the criteria of an unnamed civil servant. Yeah, awful. By the criteria of an unnamed civil servant who I suspect is an MCC member, you could perhaps get 20,000 bodies in there. All of London's local authorities have been told by the Home Office to address in detail the hard practical questions of what would need to be done with a notional number of dead people in the aftermath of a sneak nuclear attack. So,
oh my word!
Did you know that?
Wow,
amazing detail, isn't it?
I did
that in
not,
the 80s they were planning to
I
use
did
the
not know
Oval
that.
as a burial ground in case there was a nuclear attack on London. Shocking.
I mean, that's just, the Oval. It's incredible to know that happened in real life. The Oval has been used as a burial ground fictionally by the great comedian and now young adult author Charlie Higson. In one of his books, he needs to find a place to bury the casualties of a zombie attack, and into the Oval they go. But to hear that was actually a discussion that was had by real life civil servants is extraordinary.
Yeah, and on that literal bombshell.
Wow.
Thank you to my brother for joining us. Thank you all for listening, and we will be back next week, John, where we will be nominating our choice for the greatest ever innings played at the Oval. So we will see you then. Bye bye.